I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled Ukraine Proxy War. Trump picks up where Biden left off. And I've already touched on this a little bit in my last update on the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm going to go into it much more in depth with this article. As always, I will read the article for people who may not have the time or the desire to read it. I will add additional information when and if necessary. And of course, I'm going to show you all of the sources that I cited while writing this article. So let's begin. The announcement by US President Donald Trump that his administration would pick up precisely where the previous Biden administration left off and continue shipping billions of dollars in weapons and ammunition to Ukraine has taken commentators and many across the general public by surprise. And that is this article. Trump announces novel plan to send weapons to Ukraine and gives Russia new deadline to make peace and make peace. What they mean by that is agree to a ceasefire. The ceasefire the US has, since back in February, prepared European and non-European troops to then flood into Ukraine, create a Syria-style buffer zone, and not resolve the conflict in any shape, form, or way, but simply freeze it, create a tripwire force in Ukraine, with the idea in mind that Russia wouldn't dare attack European and non-European troops. These would be NATO members. But as Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth pointed out in February, and I will show you that statement here in just a minute, and the link will be in the video description below so you can read the entire statement back in February. He made it very clear that this will not be done under Article 5. It will be a coalition of the willing in essence, and that is exactly what the European and non-European nations that are accumulating under this coalition, that is what they are calling it. So President Trump went from telling everybody he was going to end the conflict in 24 hours to now flooding Ukraine with billions of dollars of weapons and ammunition. He's going to launder it through Europe. Europe is going to launder it through NATO. Nobody wants to take responsibility for this. And he's also threatening additional sanctions. And if you didn't know there was an election and you didn't pay attention to who was in the White House, you would swear that President Biden was still in office. Previous attempts by the Trump administration to coerce Russia into a ceasefire and implement a Syria-style buffer zone in Ukraine were misinterpreted by many as a genuine good faith effort to end the conflict. But it wasn't. It was just Minsk 3.0, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 being agreements the US and Europe made with Russia and separatists in eastern Ukraine to freeze the war that the separatists at the time were winning, that bought time for the West to arm and train and reshape the Ukrainian military to restart hostilities on terms that were more favorable to them. Through careful analysis, however, it was clear before President Trump even took office that no such desire, again, that's a desire for genuine peace, actually resolving the conflict, not freezing it. There was no such desire in Washington or on Wall Street, including anywhere within the incoming Trump administration. There was no desire at all to end this conflict. Instead, the U.S. seeks merely to freeze the war in Ukraine as part of a wider approach referred to as strategic sequencing, in which the U.S. pivots the majority of its resources toward dismembering the Iranian nation state and containing China and the Asia-Pacific region, before ultimately returning to more aggressive and direct conflict with Russia. So this is part of admitted division of labor and strategic sequencing. This is what people in the Trump administration itself have been saying, and this is what was written in policy papers before the US elections even took place in late 2024. These policies, and that's what I talk about, these policies have been documented in papers spanning decades, including through a number of think tanks associated specifically with President Trump himself, such as the Marathon Initiative, which was co-founded by Elbridge Colby, currently the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under President Trump, the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, and the America First Policy Institute, all of which identify Russia, along with Iran, China, and North Korea, as threats the U.S. must confront. So in all of these policy papers, the Trump administration is now implementing verbatim. Nowhere in those policy papers does it say, let's make peace with Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. They are all identified as threats the U.S. needs to deal with. These think tanks serve as interfaces between the Trump administration and well-established institutions funded by the largest, most influential interests in the collective West, where mainstream U.S. foreign policy pursuing American primacy worldwide is merely copy and pasted over to these think tanks before being rebranded and sold to the public under the Make America Great Again, MAGA slogan, or the America First slogan. Let's just take a look at these think tanks. This is the Marathon Initiative. Okay, Wes Mitchell, I talk about him frequently. He wrote a paper literally titled Strategic Sequencing Revisited. We have Project 2025. As you can see, it is 920 pages long. This is from the Heritage Foundation. Virtually everything written in this paper is now being implemented by the Trump administration. It was written in 2023. And of course, the America First Policy Institute, I talked about this months ago. I was warning people that the Trump administration had no interest at all in ending the endless wars under Pillar 6, deliver peace through strength and American leadership. I pointed out 7-8 months ago that all peace through strength is a euphemism for continued U.S. militarism abroad. Endless war abroad. They talk about Russia, China, and the Middle East. The wars were going to continue unabated, uninterrupted. Let's talk about global primacy at any cost. Washington's only objective, past, present, and future. And so what the Trump administration is doing is not the implementation of policy President Trump and the people around him came up with on their own. This is a long-standing policy the U.S. has been pursuing for decades and decades, regardless of who is in the White House, regardless of who controls Congress. These are giant corporations who seek power and profit, not just over the entire United States, but over the entire planet Earth. The pursuit of U.S. primacy worldwide has been the overarching geopolitical objective of the United States spanning the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, with the most current iteration of this policy rooted in the end of the Cold War and the establishment of strategies meant to prevent the emergence of any peer or near-peer competitor around the globe. The New York Times, in its 1992 article, U.S. Strategy Plan Calls for Ensuring No Rivals Develop, would explain this, and I want to show you this article right here. 1992 U.S. Strategy Plan Calls for Ensuring No Rivals Develop. And if you read this and you switch some of the terms are outdated, but if you switch them with more recent terms, it reads as if it could have been written today or just yesterday. And so I provide quotes from this 1992 New York Times article. Judge for yourself. The American mission will be convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interests. The classified documents, there were policy papers back then too. That is how policy is driven, through these papers. The classified document makes the case for a world dominated by one superpower. Which superpower? The United States, of course, whose position can be perpetuated by constructive behavior and sufficient military might to deter any nation or group of nations from challenging American primacy. This is literally what these modern think tanks are still repeating in the pages of their papers. Under a section of the New York Times article titled Rejecting Collective Approach, the New York Times would state, with its focus on this concept of benevolent domination by one power, the Pentagon document articulates the clearest rejection to date of collective internationalism. Collective internationalism. The strategy that emerged from World War II when the 5 victorious powers sought to form a United Nations that could mediate disputes and police outbreaks of violence. In other words, a balance of power between nations, now known as multipolarism. So back then it was called collective internationalism. It was rejected by the US then. Today is called multipolarism. The US openly rejects that today. Today, and I explained this, today, collective internationalism is referred to as multipolarism, the containment and reversal of which remains US foreign policy's highest priority. And the nation driving multipolarism, the greatest, is China. And this is why China is America's highest foreign policy priority. President Trump's threats upon coming into office in 2025 to dismantle the BRICS intergovernmental organization through a combination of tariffs and the continuation of wars and proxy wars targeting its members and allies represents the latest manifestation of this policy introduced to the public by the New York Times in 1992. And we remember articles like this, and there are many analysts out there going over this almost on a daily basis. Alex and Alexander of the Duran, Mark Sloboda, they go over these outbursts from the Trump administration quite often, targeting BRICS. Trump is threatening tariffs on a Beijing-backed group. What's got him so worried? And even CNN here, which poses as adversarial toward the Trump administration, is calling BRICS Beijing-backed, and that's just to poison it in the mind of their readership. Through a variety of means, from the establishment of the National Endowment for Democracy, that was back in the 1980s, used to undermine and politically capture the governments of targeted nations, to decades-spanning wars and proxy wars from Eastern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East to Central Asia and the Asia Pacific, aimed at destabilizing and or toppling allies and potential allies along the peripheries of Russia, Iran, and China. The US has established an arc of control spanning across the entirety of Eurasia and beyond. And this is what multipolarism is pushing back against. That is what Russia is pushing back against with its special military operation in Ukraine. And this is a war the Trump administration has taken full ownership of, always intended to. I warned people that it always intended to, and now it has openly done so. And it is a war the US seeks to continue. The targeting, encirclement, containment, and even toppling of the pillars of modern multipolarism, including a re-emerging Russian Federation, a rapidly rising China, and a resilient Iran, have defined decades of US foreign policy, transcending all presidential administrations, including those of the 21st century, from Bush Jr. and Obama to Trump, Biden, and once again during the current Trump administration. This is its second term in office. So let's talk about the Trump administration specifically. For 4 years, I reported on the Biden administration and everything it was doing to uphold this central US foreign policy objective of pursuing hegemony, of dismantling multipolarism. Let's look at all of the warning signs that existed years actually before the 2024 election actually took place. The warning signs that made it clear and absolute that President Trump was just telling people what they wanted to hear, that he had no intention of undoing any of this. He was going to pick up right where the Biden administration left off. Just like he did during his first term in office, he picked up right where the Obama administration had left off. While many who supported Donald Trump's bid for office in 2024 believed he would end the forever wars inherited by the previous Biden administration, even campaign rhetoric itself betrayed this notion. What I mean by that is that people listened to campaign rhetoric from President Trump, his vice president nominee, J.D. Vance, others who were on the campaign trail with him, and they picked and chose what they wanted to hear, and they ignored everything else. And I'm going to prove that even the campaign rhetoric itself made it clear that the war in Ukraine was going to continue, and the U.S. was simply preparing to pivot its resources toward Iran and China. Then Vice President nominee J.D. Vance in October of 2024, so a month before the elections, said that any shift away from the conflict in Ukraine would only be to double down on escalation with China and the Asia Pacific region. And that is this article here. October 28th, 2024, J.D. Vance tells Tim Dillon, U.S. needs weapons to fight China, not Russia. And so when J.D. Vance said no more weapons to Ukraine, everyone in their mind, they just heard what they wanted to hear and they interpreted it the way they wanted to. And they said, see, no more weapons for Ukraine. The war will end. But what J.D. Vance was actually saying was, we're going to need those weapons for a much larger, more dangerous, and equally unnecessary war with China. Then I talk about another article a month before October, actually. The month prior, J.D. Vance's proposed settlement in Ukraine was simply a Syria-style freeze rather than any actual resolution of the root cause of the conflict. And so if you look at this September 2024 article, J.D. Vance floats Donald Trump deal to end war in Ukraine. They're talking about a heavily fortified, demilitarized zone at the country's borders. So that's not resolving the conflict. That's just freezing it and creating a demilitarized zone between the two fighting parties. In actuality, it's the U.S. fighting Russia through Ukraine, and they wanted to simply freeze it. That's what that means. If you read this whole article, there's nowhere in there that talks about solving the root cause of the conflict. And we know that the Trump administration knows what the root cause of the conflict is because they themselves have publicly stated it. I'll get to that in just a moment. Long before elections, the Trump campaign had repeatedly stated Trump administration policy toward NATO would demand vastly greater spending from its member states, the organization itself existing solely as a means of pursuing U.S. primacy worldwide, and more specifically vis-a-vis Russia. So on the campaign trail, when President Trump said the U.S. is going to leave NATO if they don't start spending more, why does NATO exist in the first place? To confront, encircle, contain, and eventually absorb Russia. That's why it exists. So if President Trump wanted, and that is the root cause of the war in Ukraine also, and if President Trump wanted to actually end the war and solve it at its root cause, he would have solved it by saying, no more NATO. Not spend more on NATO, he would say, no more NATO. But he didn't. He said, spend more. Make it bigger, make it stronger. In essence, even before stepping foot into office, the Trump administration was laying out the division of labor and strategic sequencing because NATO member states need to spend more because the US doesn't have the resources itself to fight Russia through Ukraine, fight and dismantle Iran in the Middle East, and also confront, encircle, and contain, and eventually fight some sort of war with China in the Asia-Pacific region. So they were talking about division of labor and strategic sequencing, policies defined by unelected corporate financier-funded think tanks years before the 2024 elections even took place, policies that the Biden administration itself had helped set the stage for throughout its 4 years in office. So I talked about the Marathon Initiative. I showed the homepage of the Marathon Initiative. They have a publicly available paper published in October 2024. So again, before the 2024 elections, and it was published in October. It was obviously written before that. And it was titled Strategic Sequencing Revisited. And so it's revisiting an earlier paper that I have also covered. And this is what it says in that paper. I'm going to show you that paper here real quick, just so you can see what it looks like. It's by Wes Mitchell, Strategic Sequencing Revisited, October 18th, 2024, Marathon Initiative. It says, the United States faces a growing risk of multi-front war against Russia, China, and Iran. The optimal response to this danger would be a sequential strategy aimed at inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia and Ukraine on a faster timeline than China is prepared to move against Taiwan. By the way, Taiwan is an island province of China under international law and according to the United States' own One China policy. It agreed to with Beijing in the 1970s, and that its own State Department website acknowledges the existence of. And so how can China move against its own island province? Well, this is because the US, because of events in history, politically captured and essentially militarily occupied Taiwan. China was never able to exert full control over its own territory under international law. That is the root cause of that conflict. But for that strategy to work, the United States must use the current window wisely to shore up the situation in Eastern Europe, broker a more effective division of labor with allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and reform the U.S. defense industrial base. Division of labor. That is where this term came from. It wasn't Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth being such a brilliant strategist coming up with this on his own. He is repeating what people hand him on pieces of paper from these think tanks. Having won the elections in November 2024 and as early as February 2025, Trump administration Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth would repeat the phrase division of labor verbatim in this regard during a directive he delivered to Washington's European client states in Brussels. That is this statement here that I have referenced pretty much every single time I've talked about Ukraine since Secretary Hegseth gave these remarks on February 12, 2025. In this paper, the term establish a division of labor, that is repeated by Secretary Hegseth verbatim here. And he's talking about the US needs to pivot toward China. Europe needs to spend more on defense vis-a-vis Russia in Ukraine. There's no talk in this statement by Secretary Hegseth, nor in the policy papers he's just parroting. No talk at all about actually resolving the conflict with Russia, just freezing it so the US can deal with these other issues, these other wars it wants to provoke elsewhere, and then circle back around to deal with Russia later. Not make peace with Russia. Secretary Hegseth would say, so I'm going to read you the whole quote, just to be thorough here, because it's in the article itself. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. And how and when has China ever threatened the US inside its own homeland? And what core national interests does the US have in the Indo-Pacific region? The Indo-Pacific, or also known as the Asia-Pacific, is located literally on the other side of the planet from where the US is actually located on a map. The US is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. In other words, he's admitting the US does not have the weapons and the troops and the capabilities to continue fighting its proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, dismember Iran. He doesn't mention Iran, but that's also a priority, and also confront and attempt to contain China in the Asia-Pacific. So, client states, the US is politically captured, they're going to divert resources from their own public interests to US proxy wars. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. Secretary Hegseth, in that announcement, again, the link will be in the video description. You can read it and see for yourself. He would also demand NATO member states increase military spending from 2% to 5% of their respective GDPs. Again, this was mentioned by all of these think tanks that I have showed you. The Marathon Initiative, the America First Policy Institute, Project 2025, and the Heritage Foundation. They all made this a key priority, raising spending for NATO, raising spending on weapons by Europe. So 2% to 5% of the respective GDPs, a demand NATO member states have since committed to. Regarding the continuation of arms shipments to Ukraine, simply laundered through NATO, Secretary Hegseth demanded Europe, again, this was February 12, 2025, double down and recommit yourselves not only to Ukraine's immediate security needs, but to Europe's long-term defense and deterrence goals, through Europe providing the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. So he's not talking about ending the conflict, making peace with Russia. He's saying we don't have weapons to continue sending to Ukraine. Europe needs to keep sending them weapons to keep the war going, and we need to prioritize other wars that we're trying to provoke elsewhere. That is what he said back in February. Again, people just heard what they wanted to hear. They wanted the conflict to end. They wanted to believe that Secretary Hegseth was telling them that it was going to end, but it wasn't, and it hasn't. Worse still, Secretary Hegseth demanded America's European and non-European client states prepare their own troops to deploy into Ukrainian territory as part of security guarantees to freeze, not actually end the conflict. So that was J.D. Vance, when he was just the nominee for vice president back in September of 2024, saying, we need to freeze the conflict. We need a demilitarized zone. They were not going to resolve the root cause of the conflict. Just freeze it. That's what Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said once he assumed his position, and back in February of this year. And that is now what the Trump administration is openly saying is going to happen. This is what Europe is openly preparing to do. Even this early into the Trump administration, February, just a month after taking office, the intention was clearly not to end the war in Ukraine, but simply freeze it while pivoting toward wider confrontations with both Iran and China, both of which have since escalated, including through open war of aggression by the US against Iran. We watched that play out. I warned people about that months ahead of time as well. The ending of US arms shipments, and I warned you, I knew that it was coming because, again, it is in the policy papers. The ending of US arms shipments would be the most basic prerequisite toward ending the Ukraine war, especially considering the Trump administration's own admission that this conflict is indeed a US proxy war fought against Russia. Do you remember US Secretary of State Marco Rubio admitting that the war in Ukraine is not a war between Russia and Ukraine? Is a war between the US and Russia being fought in Ukraine. He admitted this. He admitted it, and it was covered in this article here by The Hill. Rubio says Ukraine conflict is part of US-Russia proxy war. Of course it is. It was during an interview in March 2025 when US Secretary of State Marco Rubio would admit, frankly, it's a proxy war between nuclear powers, the United States helping Ukraine, and Russia. This is a proxy war. It's not Ukraine fighting Russia. It's not Russia out of the blue just attacking Ukraine. It is a war the US deliberately engineered and is fighting and is perpetuating and is attempting to get Europe to perpetuate in its stead as it pivots toward other conflict elsewhere. The New York Times has revealed over the past 3 years of the conflict that the US had captured in 2014 and now directs the entirety of Ukraine's intelligence agencies. That is this article here, The Spy War, How the CIA Secretly Helps Ukraine Fight Putin. And this was published in 2024. And they talk about how all of this began not in 2022 when Russia launched its special military operation, but all the way back in 2014, and how the CIA established bases all along the Ukrainian-Russian border and how they control Ukraine's intelligence agencies. And so when Ukrainian intelligence agencies openly admit that they're killing politicians, journalists, and generals in the streets of Moscow, that is the CIA who trained them and direct these operations. When they say they carried out this operation to strike strategic bombers across Russia with these drones that were smuggled into the country, that is the CIA who oversaw these units doing that. That is admitted by the New York Times, and the sources they cited in that 2024 article is linked in the video description below. You can go and read it. And while the United States has from 2014 onward controlled Ukraine's intelligence agencies, there are US commanding officers operating at the top of Ukraine's armed forces chain of command from a military base in Germany. And we know that because there is this article. Here it says, the secret history of America's involvement in the Ukraine war, the partnership, the secret history of the war in Ukraine. This is the untold story of America's hidden role in Ukrainian military operations against Russia's invading armies. And they admit how every aspect of the war is being directed by US generals, not Ukrainian generals. The US is at the top of the chain of command. They were from 2022 onward, probably even before that, and they still are right now. So when President Trump says he wants to end the war, but Europe won't listen. President Zelensky in Kiev, he won't listen. It's his generals that he is the commander-in-chief of. They're the ones running the war, and he could tell them to come home at any time of his choosing. It is the CIA who ultimately answers to him and his administration. He could tell them, close down shop and come home, but he hasn't because he doesn't want to, because that is not the plan. That was never the plan. Thus, ending the war depends entirely on the party which deliberately provoked it in the first place and continues to sustain it, to dismantle the means by which it has done so while addressing the geopolitical objectives that drove this proxy war to begin with. Washington's desire to eliminate rivals, any manifestation of collective internationalism, now known as multipolarism, as per that New York Times article from 1992. But has the Trump administration done that? And the answer is no, they have not done anything of the sort. The Trump administration is doing none of these things and is instead escalating the proxy war further. Based on policy papers predating the 2024 elections, the current Trump administration has obediently implemented since. This has resulted in Russia's own steadfast policy of refusing ceasefires designed to freeze and ultimately prolong, not end the conflict. And I just saw President Zelensky in Kiev say he wants to negotiate with Russia. He's going to push for some sort of ceasefire. And I expect all sorts of theatrics to take place to try to trick, con, pressure, or corner Russia into accepting a ceasefire, because they need the ceasefire to freeze the conflict. Otherwise, if it continues as it is, eventually the Ukrainian military will collapse and Russia will take over all of Ukraine. That is what they worry about. That is why they want to freeze it. They have no desire at all whatsoever to resolve this conflict. They need to keep Russia tied down while they deal with Iran and China, and then they will come back and they will deal with Russia later. Let's talk about US-Ukraine proxy war. Was meant to tie down, overextend, not necessarily defeat Russia. This is another section of the article that I wrote, that I am reading to you. Analysts, commentators, and many across the general public have made the mistake of believing the US proxy war against Russia, fought through Ukraine, has failed because of the deterioration of Ukrainian forces and the depletion of US and European weapon stockpiles. These things are all true. This is really happening, but that does not mean that the war has been decisively won by Russia. Not yet. When it is, you will know it. But it has not happened yet. However, another policy paper published by the Rand Corporation in 2019 titled Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground. Let's look at that one. Right here. I've gone over this extensively. Extending Russia. This is a real policy paper. You can download it from the Rand Corporation's official website. It was not leaked. It's publicly available. You can read all of these from the Rand Corporation's website itself. And I've pointed out these measures that the US has since put into practice. Hinder petroleum exports, they're referring to Russian exports. Reduce natural gas exports and hinder pipeline expansions. Well, the US literally blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. Impose sanctions. Well, President Trump is going to impose some more sanctions on top of the sanctions the Biden administration imposed. Enhance Russian brain drain. And then, of course, there were the geopolitical measures, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. And that actually took place under the first Trump administration. We remember President Trump talking about sending the anti-tank missiles, the Javelin system to Ukraine in large quantities. This was almost certainly one of the reasons Russia went ahead with their special military operation. They saw Ukraine being transformed into a battering ram aimed straight at it, the same way the US did from 2003 to 2008 in Georgia. I've gone over that many times as well. They also talk about increasing support to the Syrian rebels. By rebels, they mean ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Promote regime change in Belarus, exploit tensions in the South Caucasus, reduce Russian influence in Central Asia, challenge Russian presence in Moldova. And of course, every single one of these options has been implemented and is constantly in the process of being implemented. They're not just trying to defeat Russia in Ukraine. They're putting pressure on Russia across a multitude of domains, and not just geopolitically or economically, but in information and political space. There's a cultural war taking place. It is a multi-domain operation taking place against Russia, and similar operations are taking place against Iran in the Middle East, and of course China in the Asia-Pacific region. So the RAND Corporation, extending Russia, competing from advantageous ground, stated explicitly that the goal wasn't to defeat Russia in Ukraine, but rather increase the cost to Russia of already ongoing military, economic, and political concern in Moscow regarding the US overthrow of the Ukrainian government beginning in 2014. This is a direct quote from the RAND Corporation paper. Expanding U.S. assistance to Ukraine, including lethal military assistance, would likely increase the cost to Russia in both blood and treasure of holding the Donbas region. More Russian aid to the separatists and an additional Russian troop presence would likely be required. Actually, a whole special military operation would be required, it turns out, leading to larger expenditures, equipment losses, and Russian casualties. The latter could become quite controversial at home, as it did when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And we know that U.S. planners look at the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the failure of that military operation. They look at it as a contributing factor to the fall of the Soviet Union itself. And they imagine that a similar quagmire could contribute to the deterioration, collapse, and dissolution of the Russian Federation. The paper made no illusion regarding the ultimate fate of Ukraine, warning U.S. attempts to lure Russia deeper into conflict with Ukraine could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace, and has led to all of those things. And that is a direct quote from the RAND Corporation paper as well. These are all demonstrable consequences of the conflict as of 2025, with the trajectory of the conflict pointing toward even greater costs for Ukraine the longer it continues. Ukraine is paying this cost, not the United States. Europe, to a certain extent, is, and they are online to jump into the proxy war next on behalf of the United States at their own expense. The purpose of miring Russia in a conflict in Ukraine is to prevent it from spending resources, checking U.S. aggression, encroachment, and even outright regime change elsewhere. Another option described by the 2019 RAND paper was increased support to the Syrian rebels, in reference to previously U.S.-listed terrorist organization Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an al-Qaeda subsidiary, also known as Jabhat al-Nusra. And we see what has happened with that whole conflict in Syria. Because Russia prioritized the conflict in Ukraine, its ongoing military operations in Syria could not be expanded sufficiently to meet continued U.S. support toward regime change there, culminating in the collapse of the Syrian government in late 2024 under the Biden administration. And we can see the U.S. consolidating control over Syria under the Trump administration. And President Trump himself literally shaking hands with the head of HTS, a U.S.-listed foreign terrorist organization that the Trump administration itself has since delisted as a terrorist organization. And not because it isn't a terrorist organization anymore, but because the U.S. plans to more openly back it, almost certainly arm it, and then use it against Iran and its allies in the region further, beyond Syria. As with Russia, so with the rest of the multipolar worlds. So this is the final section of my article. This process of creating strategic dilemmas along Russia's peripheries to both overextend it and prevent it from countering U.S. geopolitical objectives elsewhere is also being employed against Iran and China, all as part of a division of labor and strategic sequencing approach toward maintaining global domination, as described by the New York Times in 1992 and pursued by Washington ever since. Considering the Trump administration itself is openly committed to this overarching geopolitical objective and has demonstrated its commitment to the policies required to achieve it, the continuation of the wars and proxy wars facilitated by these policies should come as no surprise. I warned people before President Trump stepped foot into office that he was going to do all of these things because it was written down on a piece of paper. People in his administration wrote these papers. They're now in his administration implementing these policies. This is continuity of agenda. This is how it works. And this is how you know in what direction it will go. You read the policy papers. You ignore the rhetoric and you read the policy papers. While some commentators claim President Trump has been since coerced into or convinced to adopt the continuation of the Ukraine war, both think tanks connected to his administration long before even the 2024 elections were held, and the administration itself since have merely picked up right where the previous Biden administration left off, and they always intended to do so. Trump administration talk of ending the conflict was a means to both pander to segments of the American voting public, as well as lure Russia into a ceasefire that would allow the US to freeze, not end, the conflict and pivot with many more resources to pursue war and proxy war against both Iran and China. Russia's refusal to capitulate to US demands has forced the US to continue committing weapons, ammunition, and other resources to the conflict in Ukraine, reducing the amount of resources the US can pursue global war with elsewhere. Despite the many weaknesses of the US exposed by its proxy war with Russia and Ukraine, its ability to nonetheless continue the conflict, overthrow the Syrian government last year, ignite direct war with Iran in the Middle East, and continue building up military forces in the Asia Pacific against China, demonstrate it still possesses global spanning power and thus poses a serious global spanning danger. The continuity of agenda demonstrated by the Trump administration, despite diametrically opposite rhetoric during the 2024 campaign, is a reminder that change within the United States will not come through elections, because the special interests devising all of this policy and handpicking the politicians who go into office to implement it, or at least sell it to the public, are going to make sure that no matter who you vote for, that person is going to pick up and continue this agenda, just like President Trump predictably did. For the second time, by the way. The US will continue to pose a global spanning threat until there exists interest in the US that can displace those currently directing its foreign policy who choose to cooperate with the rest of the world rather than maintain dominion over it. Until then, it is incumbent upon the multipolar world to create the conditions worldwide within which the US is simply unable to pursue interference, coercion, and aggression any further. And it's incumbent upon the multipolar world to wake up and get a grip on reality, to not fall for the political theater that takes place, not just in the United States, but across the collective West, to wake up and realize that this agenda is deeply rooted in unelected interests that are not going to allow people to veto their intentions, their desires, and their interests, that the multipolar world is going to have to force the US to stop doing these things. You're not going to reason, rationalize, negotiate, or cut some sort of deal with people that think like this. They are driven toward global primacy. They will accept nothing less. And any notion of negotiation or ceasefire or any notion of peace is just a means for them to buy time and wait for a moment they can drive the dagger into your back the minute you turn around and give them an opportunity to do so. And they have done this over and over and over again, and they will continue to do it over and over and over again. And I wish I could say that President Trump shocked everybody. He tricked everyone. It was so convincing, but it wasn't. Because if you actually listened to what he was saying, he told you he was going to do all of these things. Yes, he said he was going to end the war in 24 hours. Yes, he said he was going to fight the deep state. He said all of these things. What evidence did you have that he was telling you the truth about that? But then also he said they're going to freeze the war in Ukraine, not end it. They were going to stop sending weapons to Ukraine because they needed the weapons for wars elsewhere. Why would he lie about that? Why would that be a lie? Why would he say that and that be a lie? That was obviously the truth. So he told you the truth. He told you a bunch of lies. The truth and the lies were obvious to see because the truth dovetails in with continuity of agenda, And all of these lies were simply to pander to the American public, also pander to the global public, even pander to global leaders and governments around the globe. And so I hope people have learned an important lesson here about continuity of agenda. I hope people stop falling for the theater that is Western-style democracy. It is not a process of self-determination. It is a process of not just control over the respective populations of the West and all nations that practice Western-style democracy, including nations well outside the collective West. It is also a means of deceiving, distracting, and dividing governments around the world. I think that there were people in government around the world that honestly believed President Trump represented some sort of change. I bet that there are people in governments around the world who did not see this coming and are shocked by these developments, who don't fully understand what they are seeing and why, because they're not paying attention to the policy papers. They do not actually understand the actual structure of Western power. The structure of Western power in their mind is an illusion. It does not exist. The real structure of power that drives the West and its policies are these unelected special interests, because they aspire toward global empire, and this is such a massive thing, you cannot keep it hidden. And so it isn't hidden. It is explained in excruciating detail on the pages of these policy papers, publicly available across the internet from the official websites of these think tanks. These think tanks all have YouTube channels. They have policymakers come together and talk about this endlessly, week after week, hours after hours after hours of discussion and explanation of what they are actually going to do, while the rest of the world, for some reason, is not looking at that, not listening to it, not reading it, but instead being trapped by the rhetoric coming out of politicians in Washington, in London, and in Brussels. So I hope people redirect their attention to these interests, their think tanks, their policy papers. The more people start pointing their attention toward these policy papers, the more self-aware they will become that people are now looking, and the more deception they will add into that. So that is something that you have to try to get ahead of them for a change. Try to get ahead of them. But there are just certain things that they have to write out, they have to build consensus for, that you can match with real-world events, real-world preparation to implement these policies, again, regardless of what is being said in the halls of political, I would say, theater rather than power. I will continue keeping an eye on this. I will continue diving into these papers and explaining it to the best of my ability. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos are published on YouTube, on Telegram, on X, and also on Rumble. I have a blog. I have had this blog since 2009, 2010. I have literally thousands of articles that I have written over the years. You can search for different topics here in this search box, and I still update it with my most recent articles and the videos associated with those articles. Those are all on here. In the video description are all the links that I referenced in this video, including the article that I was just reading, this article from New Eastern Outlook. The link will be there. You can read it in its entirety. You can share it with others. And finally, also in the video description are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them or block them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. The links to those will be in the video description below. And for everyone who has been helping, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you don't have any extra resources and you're just helping share my work with others, all of this is greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.